My name is Leo Schmidt, and I was a fire controlman aboard the U.S. Navy light cruiser, USS Helena CL-50. People know her from history books and documentaries, but I need you to know that to me, to the 868 of us who served on her, she was not a collection of data, not a black and white photograph. She was a living, breathing goddess of vengeance. Hawaii, in 1941, was the very picture of paradise sunshine, palm trees, a gentle sea breeze, and anchored around Ford Island, the gray and majestic steel wall of the U.S. Pacific Fleet. The Helena was still young among them, commissioned only in 1939, and she carried the distinct scent of new paint and machinery. I loved everything about her. I loved her graceful 185-meter hull, her wide decks, and most of all, her 5 triple-barreled 6-inch gun turrets. As a fire controlman, those turrets were my sanctuary. 15. Mark 16 guns. They were the voice with which we would speak to God and our enemies. We were young then, invincible. The war burning in Europe and China felt like a story from a distant planet. Our days were a routine of drills, maintenance, and bragging in the cheap bars of Honolulu that was until December 7, 1941. I remember it clearly. It was a Sunday. I had just come off watch and was about to get breakfast. Suddenly, a violent explosion, not a drill, but the malevolent sound of tearing metal. I rushed to the deck, and the sight before me burned every image of paradise from my mind. The sky was a swarming hive of enemy planes painted with the red meatball insignia. Ahead of us, the USS Arizona was belching black, hopeless smoke. We were moored at berth 1010 in the Navy Yard, with the mine layer USS Oglala to our outboard side. I watched a Japanese torpedo bomber skim low across the water, a dark shape dropping from its belly. That torpedo, like a deadly dolphin, slyly passed beneath the shallow draft of the Oglala and slammed directly into us. The impact was amidships on the starboard side, right near an engine room. The entire ship felt like it had been struck by a giant's fist, lurching violently to port. Steel groaned and twisted as the sea rushed in with thunderous force. Alarms, explosions, and the shouts of men blended into a symphony of hell. The blast cut the main power, plunging my fire control station into darkness. But we were well drilled. The backup diesel generators kicked in within 2 minutes. Power was restored, and the turrets could turn again. We began to fight back, pouring fury into the sky with our 127mm secondary guns and anti-aircraft machine guns. But it was short-lived. Another torpedo crippled one of our engine rooms and a boiler room, leaving us temporarily powerless. We could only watch helplessly as the Oglala next to us, her hull ripped open by the shockwave of our own explosion, slowly rolled to port and capsized like a great dead whale. By the end of that day, the harbor was a scene of utter devastation. The once great steel wall had become a chain of burning ruins. We survived, but our pride died in its place. Something cold and hard crystallized in the hearts of our 868 crewmen. It wasn't hatred. Hatred is impulsive. This was something deeper, more enduring, a vow of vengeance. On that day, the Helena ceased to be just a warship. She became a promise, a blood pact we made to all our fallen brothers. We underwent a long and thorough repair at the Mare Island Navy Yard. The wounds torn by the torpedo were stitched together with new steel plates, and burnt wiring was replaced. But this refit brought us far more than just physical healing. High on the mast, above the bridge, engineers installed something we had never seen before, a rotating antenna that looked like a bedspring. They called it SG radar. In those days, that thing was black magic. An officer explained that it would allow us to see enemy ships miles away, in the deepest night, in the thickest fog. In the control room, a cathode ray tube screen would display targets as green blips of light. It was revolutionary at the time. This radar, combined with our 15 deadly 6-inch guns, formed a new and terrifying combination. Our shells were the Mark 35 super heavy armor-piercing type, incredibly powerful. Our fire control system was state-of-the-art. When the Helena returned to the Pacific Fleet in the summer of 1942, she had been reborn. We took this secret weapon south to the deadly waters of the Pacific, known as Iron Bottom Sound, to fulfill our promise, Guadalcanal. At that time, the name meant mud, jungle, disease, and endless fighting. The Navy's job was to stop the Japanese from landing reinforcements and supplies on the island. On the night of October 11, 1942, Rear Admiral Norman Scott's Task Force 64 was on patrol near Savo Island. We, the Helena, were at the rear of the cruiser column. The night was black as ink, visibility near zero. The only sounds were the thrum of our engines and the slice of our bow through the water. The atmosphere was as tense as a drawn bowstring. At 23:25, the miracle happened. Radar contact, bearing 315, range 27,700 yards. The voice of the radar operator in my station was calm but firm. Those green blips flickered sharply on our PPI scope, like a swarm of will-o'-the-wisps. We were the first in the entire fleet to spot the enemy. Our captain, Hoover, immediately reported it to Admiral Scott on the flagship USS San Francisco. But what followed was maddening silence. Admiral Scott's flagship didn't have our new radar. He couldn't confirm the targets and worried they might be our own destroyers. Seconds stretched into minutes as the distance between us and the enemy rapidly closed. We could see the Japanese sailing in a neat column, completely unaware they were sailing into our embrace. It was a perfect crossing the T, the ideal position from naval textbooks. We could bring all our broadside guns to bear on their bows, while they could only reply with their forward turrets. "Request permission to open fire," Captain Hoover urged over the radio. "Stand by, confirming target," was the hesitant reply from the flagship. The range had closed to 5,000 yards. Any longer, and the advantage would be lost. Captain Hoover made his request again, in code, almost pleading. Finally, at 23:46, permission was granted. When the order reached my fire control station, I felt a jolt of electricity surge through me, calculating, ranging, adjusting. Every move was fluid. I relayed the firing command down the voice tube to the turrets below. "Open fire." In that instant, all hell broke loose. The 9 6-inch guns on Helena's port side roared in unison. 15 shells, each turret had a 3-gun salvo preloaded, tore through the night sky. Our gunners were so well trained that their rate of fire was blistering, reaching nearly 10 rounds per minute. Within seconds, the muzzle flashes blended into one continuous sheet of light, as if a great, furious fire dragon were roaring at our side. Our first salvo struck the Japanese flagship, the heavy cruiser Ioba, setting her bridge ablaze. The next was for the destroyer Fubuki. It practically melted under our barrage. For the next several minutes, we were like calm, efficient butchers, systematically blanketing every target the fleet identified in a sea of fire that was the U.S. Navy's first victory over the Imperial Japanese Navy in a nighttime surface engagement. We, the cruiser that had been nearly sunk at Pearl Harbor, had fired the first shot of revenge. We had washed away our shame with the blood of the enemy. After that night, the Helena's reputation began to spread through the darkness of the Solomon Islands. The Japanese later gave us a nickname. I can't confirm it, but the sailors all said it. They called us the machine gun cruiser because our continuous gunfire sounded like a giant machine gun firing. On Friday, November 13, 1942, an unlucky day, we faced an even harsher test. Rear Admiral Daniel Callahan's fleet was ordered to intercept a powerful Japanese bombardment force spearheaded by the battleships Hiei and Kirishima. Their mission was to destroy Henderson Field on Guadalcanal. On paper, we were hopelessly outmatched. We had no battleships, only cruisers and destroyers. Just after midnight, our SG radar was once again the first to find the enemy. At 1:24, the scope lit up with a dense cluster of contacts, 32,000 yards out. This time, the enemy was more numerous and their formation more complex. Admiral Callahan faced the same dilemma as Scott. His flagship, the San Francisco, had older radar, and he couldn't see what we saw. Confusion in communication and tactical hesitation led us straight into the heart of the Japanese formation. At 1:50, the brawl erupted. The distance between ships was so close you could have used a pistol. Admiral Callahan gave a controversial order. Odd ships fired to starboard, even ships fired to port. In that chaos, the command was nearly impossible to execute, but aboard the Helena, it was not a problem. In my station, the radar operator calmly called out one target after another. We fed them into the fire control computer and delivered death with precision. I'll never forget it. We flicked on our searchlight, locking onto a Japanese destroyer. The instant the beam hit her, our 15 main guns began to roar at their maximum rate of fire. I heard later that for a moment, we exceeded our theoretical rate of fire, reaching 17 rounds per minute. That poor destroyer was torn to shreds and became a burning sieve in less than 2 minutes. In that hellish battle, our gunfire was like lightning, illuminating the darkness again and again, and each flash was accompanied by the destruction of an enemy ship. We watched our flagship, the San Francisco, get savaged by the Haiyai's 14-inch shells, killing Admiral Callahan and most of the bridge crew. We saw the Atlanta turn into a torch under both friendly and enemy fire. We saw the Juno, with the 5 Sullivan brothers aboard, get hit by a torpedo and sink later, and us, the Helena. It was as if we were possessed by the god of war himself. We weaved through the inferno, taking only scattered hits, a shell through the forward funnel, another that wrecked a searchlight platform, and one that hit a seaplane crane, but none were fatal. We just kept firing until our gun barrels glowed red, firing until the enemy broke and fled. The battle lasted less than half an hour, but it felt like a century. By dawn, the sea was littered with wreckage and oil slicks. Both American and Japanese forces had suffered terrible losses, but we had succeeded. We had stopped the Japanese from bombarding the airfield, paving the way for the ultimate victory in the Guadalcanal campaign. The Helena was scarred, but her head was held high. With a most brutal victory, she had proven herself the deadliest light cruiser in the Pacific. Her 868 crewmen had completely transformed the tragedy of Pearl Harbor into the glory of Guadalcanal. By 1943, we were veterans of the Solomon Islands. We patrolled those dangerous waters, escorted convoys, and bombarded shore targets. The Helena's reputation grew, and her every sortie struck fear into the Japanese. On the night of July 5, 1943, we set out again. The mission, to intercept a Japanese destroyer flotilla attempting to land troops on Kolombangara Island. The location, Kula Gulf. This time, everything felt like routine. Just after midnight, our SG radar was once again the first to pick up the enemy. We closed in calmly, maneuvering for an advantageous position. Admiral Ainsworth, having learned from previous battles, put his complete trust in our radar. At 1:57 on July 6th, the Admiral gave the order, "Commence firing." Once again, the Helena opened the battle with her thunderous salvos. Our shells rained down like hail on the Japanese destroyer Nizuki, instantly crippling her and killing the Japanese commander, Rear Admiral Akiyama. The battle seemed to be heading for another textbook victory, but this time, our greatest strength became our fatal flaw. In our pursuit of maximum rate of fire and destructive power, we had never used flashless powder. This meant that every salvo from our 15 guns produced enormous, 50-foot-long tongues of orange-red flame. In the pitch-black night, this was no different from lighting a giant neon sign in the middle of the battlefield that read, "Fire here." The still-fighting Japanese destroyers, Suzukaze and Tanakaze, used our spectacular and deadly muzzle flashes as perfect aiming points for their long lance torpedoes. At 2:04, disaster struck. The first torpedo hit us in the bow. It didn't feel like an explosion, more like the whole ship had run into an underwater mountain. The tremendous impact threw me from my seat. Before I could even react, a second and a third torpedo followed, striking with deadly accuracy in the same vulnerable midsection that had been hit at Pearl Harbor. This time, there was no chance of survival. Her keel was broken. The deck beneath my feet let out a heart-shattering shriek of twisting metal and then buckled violently upwards. The Helena, that proud warship, broke into 3 pieces in a matter of seconds. Abandon ship, the order came, but I could barely hear it over the roar of inrushing water and the screams of wounded shipmates. I scrambled for the deck and leaped into the warm, oily sea. I looked back once, the last time I would ever see her in one piece. The bow and stern sections sank quickly, while the midsection remained afloat, a burning island of steel. Then it, too, was gone, swallowed by the dark ocean she had fought in for so many nights. The USS Helena had sunk. Our story should have ended there. But for 700 of us, the harshest ordeal had just begun. The waters of Kula Gulf were filled with survivors. We clung to debris, encouraging one another. The destroyers, USS Nicholas and USS Radford, arrived to rescue us, pulling some of our men from the water. But soon, an alert of approaching enemy ships forced them to suspend the rescue. They had to withdraw with those they had already saved, leaving the majority of us behind. We were abandoned. The next few hours were a test of will. A group of us, about 200 men, discovered a miracle. The bow section of the Helena, its watertight compartment still intact, was floating. It was like a giant, tilted life raft. Our captain, Cecil, was among us. He organized us and maintained discipline. At dawn, a PB-4Y Liberator patrol bomber spotted us and dropped life rafts and vests. But real rescue was still far away. The wind and currents began to push our piece of wreckage towards enemy-held Kolombangara. We knew that capture was a fate worse than death, so we made a difficult decision to abandon the bow and, using only the life rafts and small boats, paddle in the opposite direction toward Vella Lavella Island, which we hoped was safe. It was a journey through hell. We were exhausted and thirsty, and many of us were wounded. Sharks circled us, and we could only beat them back with our paddles and shouts. Some of the most badly injured brothers quietly passed away during the journey. We would say a short prayer for them and then commit their bodies to the sea. After nearly 2 days of drifting, we finally saw the coast of Vella Lavella. We made it ashore, exhausted but alive. As luck would have it, we were found by 2 Australian coast watchers and friendly local islanders. They hid us and radioed our position to Guadalcanal. Meanwhile, another group of about 88 survivors, organized by an officer after the battle, had sailed a lifeboat for a day and a night and were eventually rescued by a destroyer near Rice Anchorage. After that battle, I was assigned to other ships and continued to serve. It wasn't until 2 years later, when Japan surrendered, that the United States achieved total victory, and I, too, left the service to begin a new life. My whole life, I have lived in the shadow of that ship. I married, had children, and watched the world change. But a part of my soul will forever remain in the waters of Kula Gulf on that night of July 6, 1943. It rests there with my 168 brothers, sleeping in the deep 2,800 feet below the surface.